Hey, this is Skyler with Regan. We're going to break down debt on the government side, the consumer side, and the corporate side from official government data. And a lot's been talked about this. And we're going to start with currently the federal deficit, which is almost as large as it's ever been at about $1.8 trillion. During COVID, we got to a low of negative 3 trillion plus. Okay. And that's a huge number. The government spending almost $2 trillion more than it's generating in tax revenue. Okay. Further to that, we can see government debt exploding at 35 plus trillion dollars. Okay. If we go back to the GFC, where it was less than 10 trillion, the government's effectively spent $25 trillion now in the last 17, 18 years. Huge amount of expenditures at the government level. Okay. That's frightening. But we have to take that with a grain of salt, and we have to look at the math behind government spending and look at that versus where consumers and corporations sit. Okay. So if we look at that deficit number, and then we look at US government net worth, now not including roads, infrastructure, et cetera, that have been built, the government has about $4 trillion in assets versus that $35 trillion in debt. So their balance sheet's negative $31 trillion. But when we look at households, okay, households have a net worth today of $164 trillion. Okay. So if we look at that versus where we were back coming out of the GFC, where US net worth was about 60 trillion. And reminder, the government spent 25 trillion between here and here. US net worth went from 60 trillion to $164 trillion, a gain of 104 trillion. So the government's effectively gotten 4x what it's spent via growth of the consumer. But going just back to COVID here, where coming out of COVID, US consumers had a net worth of about 111 trillion, and today they're at 164. That's a 50% move in wealth growth. Okay. So let's go back and think about, well, what about corporations? Okay. So you have US consumer net worth, which has grown from real estate appreciation and stock market appreciation primarily, but you also have private corporations in what they've grown. But in terms of corporate net worth stands at 39 trillion. Okay. So when you add all this up, and we'll get to that corporate data in a second, but when you add all this up, you have a net worth in the United States of $172 trillion. Okay. Roughly almost about 5.5x what the government net worth is. So we'll take a look at a couple more charts here. We'll look at corporate assets, which stand at 61 trillion. Versus corporate debt, which stands at 21 trillion. That's how we get that roughly $40 trillion in corporate net worth. But what's even more impressive is when we look at corporate leverage. Okay. So this is debt as a percentage of market value of equities. Okay. We stand at about 19% today, 20%. Almost the lowest level in recorded history of debt on corporate balance sheets. So you have debt at very, very low levels. Now, it doesn't look like that, but as a percentage basis, debt on very low levels, and also debt on the consumer side at relatively low levels. Okay, so you take this, you look at what's under the line here, the red line, that's consumer liabilities. Long story short, while you'll see charts that look at credit card data, student loan data, automobile data, add all that up, it pales in comparison. That all consumer debt's at about 5 trillion, residential debt's I think at 13 trillion, 14 trillion. Add all that up, and even including the government debt, it pales in comparison to the growth that we've seen since COVID and since the GFC. So some good data here. I put out where exactly all this data comes from over here. It either comes from the Federal Reserve or its subsidiary, the St. Louis Fed, Fred, which is a great website. Thank you for your time.